Hi, my name is Jim Mason. I am Programme Leader for Music Production at University of Chester. This is part of a series of talks called the Kitchen Sessions, and it's where University of Chester lecturers deliver talks from their kitchens. This is my kitchen. Welcome to it. I'm not actually doing this live, so I'm not talking right now. This has been pre-recorded by me, but I've got to try and do it in one shot, so with no editing. So it might be a little bit haphazard as well, but I'm going to try and do it in one single shot. Yes, like I said, it's part of the talk series called the Kitchen Sessions. I teach music production. I will also be available in the comments, probably now, so there'll be another version of me typing in the comments, probably over here or wherever it is. So you can ask me questions as we go along, you can make comments. You can ask anything you want, and at the end, this other version of me will be available to do like Q&A at the end. Okay, so like I said, I teach music production at University of Chester. We do a lot of practical music production type stuff, where we record bands, we do music sequencing, and a whole load of other stuff. And it is quite a practically orientated program. But something else that we do is we do spend a bit of time looking into producers and production styles. It's something I really like to do, actually. And today I'm going to talk to you about some producers and production styles. And the main thing I want to really focus on is how crucial it is that the relationship between the artist and the producer is, that is absolutely central to the working relationship on an album. In fact, the more I read, the more I speak to producers, the more I realise how important the working relationship between the producer and the artist is as regards to the success of what they're actually working on together. And you might kind of go, yeah, well, that's like really obvious. Obviously, they're going to need to have a good working relationship in order to produce, make good results. That's like not anything new. I think what maybe is new, or maybe new, is just how important that is. The more I read about this, the more I think about it, the more I talk to producers and so on, the more I realise how important that relationship actually is, not just to the track or the album being worked on, but also to their continuing trajectory of their careers. Sometimes it can be absolutely life-changing. I read once this magazine article, I think it was in Sound on Sound, with Phil Ramone, legendary producer Phil Ramone. And I thought, that's great, it's going to be an interview with Phil Ramone. And Ramone is going to sort of tell me what compressors he uses to do his vocals and what EQ settings he uses and all of that sort of stuff. But actually, the interview with Phil Ramone doesn't discuss that. All it talks about is his working relationships with the artist and how he gets the best performance out of his artists. And at first, I thought it was a bit disappointing. But then, the more I read it, the more I kind of realised, actually, it was a bit of a game-changing interview for me, actually. I thought, wow, actually, this really is what music production is about. Some albums have become hugely successful because of that, just that working relationship, just that partnership. Albums like Madonna's 1998 Ray of Light, produced by William Orbit, is often credited as like really revitalising her career and being quite a landmark album in production and in terms of her career as an artist. There are various others as well. You could talk about Nigel Godrich producing Radiohead on OK Computer. You could talk about Rick Rubin's production on Slayer's Rain in Blood album, where he kind of came in and the working relationship with the two was so strong. And in some ways, he actually revitalised and changed thrash metal production. He gave it a new template, which a lot of people then took on board after that. So, there was some really groundbreaking stuff going on. In a way, it's kind of like bringing together a producer and an artist together. You get a result that's more than the sum of its parts. So, like, for example, mayonnaise, on its own, not very nice. Well, it's all right. Tomatoes on their own, all right. Tomatoes and mayonnaise together, really tasty. So I'm sure you get the point that I'm making. Sometimes, though, if it doesn't go right, it can go really wrong. on the Beatles album Let It Be. Phil Spector did some production work on that, and it was famously quite problematic. Phil Spector, probably one of the biggest producers, if not the biggest producer at the time. Beatles, almost certainly the biggest act at the time. You would think bringing them together might actually, it's common sense, really, isn't it? You're going to bring the best producer, you're going to bring the best artist together, and what they make is going to be fantastic. But the point is, and one of the key points I'm making is that isn't always the way it actually works. And in the case of Spector and the Beatles, it didn't work particularly well at all. It kind of calls to mind, like, I'm going to do a football analogy now. I'm not a football expert, but I remember there was one time when Chelsea, it was during the Abramovich era, Chelsea bought Andrei Shevchenko, and Chelsea were like the richest club in the world at that point, and Shevchenko was the best player in the world at that point. And the logic said biggest club in the world, best player in the world, equals great results. But actually, it didn't work out like that, and I think that's kind of an important lesson as well there. Sometimes the producer on the album for the same artist can actually make an enormous difference to their career. It could be argued that Happy Mondays, Pills, Thrills and Bellyaches, Paul Oakenfold's work with the band on that album was pretty much era-defining, whereas the follow-up album, Yes Please, produced by Tina Weymouth and Chris Frantz, arguably went the other way and was, possibly through nobody's fault, but for a number of reasons was pretty bad. And I mean, there's certainly an argument to suggest that it contributed to the bankruptcy of Factory Records. They spent a lot of money, and it was all done in Barbados, but things didn't go well. I think it's safe to say. So what is record production? What is music production anyway? And actually, it's a question that I often get asked, and there's one that's not a particularly easy question to answer. There's actually a whole book written on this by a colleague of mine, Craig, I should say, Golding, and Russ Hepworth-Sayer, and they wrote a book, What is Music Production? Not actually, I mean, it can be so many different things to so many different people. There are certain producers who have a trademark sound, like, for example, Phil Spector, with his famous wall of sound production technique and style that he would stamp on all his records. Martin Hannett's another example of that. The way he used delay, his particular techniques for recording drums, his integration of sound effects within the music production. So you get these producers with like a trademark style that the record label get them in because they want that style on their record. There are also other big producers who specifically don't have a trademark sound. Hit Boy, for example, a very successful recent producer, said himself in interviews he doesn't really have a trademark sound. Stargate may be another example of a production team like that. There are producers who want to control all of the production process and really be massively in creative control. I think Stock Aitken Waterman, possibly an example of a production team that are always want to be in the driving seat, let's just say. And the singers, often in the case of Stock Aitken Waterman Records, were singers, but they had a limited amount of other creative input. The same could be said for Cheiron, the big production team containing Max Martin from the turn of the century. You had Britney Spears, Backstreet Boys, and so on. Martin himself admits that he wants to be in control of every nuance of what goes on those records in interviews. And then on the other hand, you've got producers who very much let the artist lead the way and give them the creative control over the record. Today I want to talk to you specifically about one record in particular, which I think is a really good case study because there are lots of issues that were bound up in the recording of this album, and that's the Human League's 1986 album, Crash. And what happened with this album was that the producers and the artists had very different ideologies, they had very different visions, they had very different attitudes towards music and production and creation process. And in hindsight, you can go, putting them, the Human League, with the production team on it, Jam and Lewis, you could say, that's never going to work. Like, whose idea was that? Having said that, I think that it's very easy to say those sorts of things in hindsight, particularly for me. And let me just say, I was only 11 years old at the time this album was produced. I was sitting in my bedroom on my little Yamaha PSR 70 home keyboard. So, I'm not exactly in a great position to kind of say, you shouldn't have done that. And actually, I'm not really saying that. I think there's an argument to suggest that you put two people together with very different working styles, and you could end up with a fantastic result. So I would suggest it's a high-risk strategy and not necessarily a bad strategy. So definitely not blaming Virgin Records or the band or the production team or anything for the idea. Of course, I ought to just say, I wasn't there. I've gathered all this information through reading interviews in detail with various sort of members of the band and the producers and so forth. But I wasn't actually there. And one thing I want to say at this stage is that I need to be a little bit careful also about what I say here for obvious reasons, and so I'm going to err slightly on the side of caution when it comes to some of the bolder statements, let's just say. But, I'll let you think about what possible things could have been going on there. Okay, so the Human League, they were a massive pop act at the time. In 1980, end of 81, start of 82, following the humongous success of their album Dare, and particularly the single Don't You Want Me. Human League were one of the biggest pop acts in the world, and they were extremely successful around about that period. After that, they did fall into a slightly more difficult situation with their 1984 album Hysteria, which I don't actually seem to have in my pile of CDs for some reason. So with Hysteria, the 1984 album, it was very much more of a difficult process. The hits slightly declined in terms of the popularity of the band, but they were still a massive priority for Virgin Records. And in fact, they still were coming off the back of a string of 10 UK top 20 singles, which showed remarkable consistency, really. And they were still a huge act with a huge priority for Virgin Records. Jam and Lewis, they were arguably even hotter at that time. They'd had a number of smash hits, like with SOS Band, Just Be Good to Me, Sherelle and Alexander O'Neill doing Saturday Love, and most notably with Janet Jackson's Control album, which was released early in 1986 and was a hugely successful album, and in fact a good example of a production team and an artist working together to create something that's more than some of its parts. Control really revitalised Janet Jackson's career after two quite, let's just say, not particularly successful albums. And it started a new sound, it started, all sorts of things, a very, very positive album there. So that's where we were. And the decision was made to put the Human League together with Jam and Lewis, and then we're going to make an album together over in Minneapolis. But the thing about this album was that there were a number of key ideological, I believe, fundamental differences in their priorities and in their working styles and working in their philosophies. And that's why I want to particularly talk about this album. One of them is the idea of creating music in real time as opposed to creating it outside of real time. And what I mean by that is you can create music by playing it, by jamming, by coming up with ideas. You can record music by playing and recording it. But you can also create music entirely outside of real time. You can program it in, you can tell a computer what you want to be played at particular moments. And this kind of inside and outside of real time thing was a big key part of a difference between what was going on. In fact, the Human League themselves, despite having a synthesizer-led sound, and in fact their whole philosophy was actually about synthesizers and vocals only. So they had this synthesizer-led sound, but they weren't actually keyboard players. None of them were. There were 6 of them. The 2 female members weren't, by their own admission, dancers or singers at all. They were just 2 girls, in fact, who were dancing in a nightclub, and Philip Oakey saw them dancing and he asked them to join the band. It was as simple as that, really. Philip Oakey and Adrian Wright themselves say they were not really musicians, not really keyboard players. Ian Burden was a bass player predominantly. Joe Callis was predominantly a guitarist. So really, at that time, not really any keyboard players. and they were all about the programming and the synthesizers rather than the actual playing. Jam and Lewis, on the other hand, they were players. They loved to play. They say in interviews they like to just hit the tape and go for gold, and all of those wonderful imperfections that come out are just part of the vibe, part of the record. So Jam and Lewis are very much about performing. So the Human League came over, and Jam and Lewis were like, okay, let's go, let's hit the tape, let's see what we can do or whatever. And the Human League were like, kind of like, oh, well, that's actually not how we work. You know, so straight away there was that difference. Jam and Lewis are notably particularly not sequency people at all. Jimmy Jam says in interviews he didn't really bother getting his head around, or, you know, he wasn't interested in sequencing because he just liked to play. So even if you get an 8-minute Jam and Lewis record, sometimes that entire 8 minutes is just Jimmy Jam playing the whole bass line on his keyboard, just constantly throughout the track. No programming, no looping, nothing like that. And that, in fact, that's a kind of a reasonably unusual approach at that time, and in fact since then. But Jam and Lewis, you know, they like to play. So there was a big thing there about that. Okay. Now, interestingly, and here's something that I find quite interesting. On the Human League's Crash album, this is the album I'm talking about. On the sleeve, I don't know if you can see here. It says here. Oh, here. There are no sequences on this record. I don't think you can see that. It also says many of the keyboard parts and arrangements are by Paul Rabiger. Seems like a bit of an unusual thing to say on a record sleeve. There are no sequences on this record. I thought maybe that's a Jam and Lewis thing. Maybe that's a thing they put on all their records because they want to show that they're playing everything live. But in actual fact, it doesn't seem to crop up on that many other Jam and Lewis records. So I wonder if there was some kind of point being made here about sequencing in relation to this particular project. I'll let you have a little think about that. Another issue, which is kind of connected, was to do with work rate. The Jam and Lewis were very much about get it done, get the business done. They had quite a good work rate. The Human League, famously, particularly on the Hysteria album, had a very slow work rate. There's actually an interview with Philip Oakey in the Making Music. I think it was Making Music. And this is an article I've not actually been able to find since. But when I bought it like years ago, it had an article with Philip Oakey in it, and he was joking that it took them 3 weeks. I don't know if this is true or not. It took them 3 weeks to program a kick drum part on one of the tracks on Hysteria. 3 weeks for just a kick drum, get the kick drum sound right, get the part right. And he jokes that Prince, when he made his Purple Rain album, actually made the whole album in a quicker time than the Human League took to program this like one kick drum part. Now, I don't know how true that is actually, but it is safe to say that Prince was very famous for having a really high work rate. Of course, he's a very prolific musician, and he sort of respects a lot of the people around him. And Jam and Lewis, notably, had a very close relationship with Prince because they were in the band that he formed at the time. So, you know, they may have been more into the Prince way of working. They may have been influenced by Prince in terms of their working style, hit the tape, we're playing, and so on. So, whereas the Human League, I think, were more about, and just as commendably, let's just spend so much time on the meticulousness of this so we get this absolutely right, and we're not going to stop until it's absolutely perfect. There was another thing going on here, also about kind of tight and dry versus wet and loose. This is in some ways a bit of a US-UK slight difference, but there's a bit more complex than that. Jam and Lewis are definitely about the big sounds, about the loose sound, about the big wet reverbs and so on. Big reverbs on the snare. Let's have a big sound. Human League at the time, particularly Hysteria, and particularly those singles like Louise, Life on Your Own, very dry sound, not that much reverb going on, quite sparse arrangements. You know, so there was a massive difference in philosophy between the big, wet, loose sound of Jam and Lewis and the dry, specific, and kind of more minimal sound of Human League. there was another thing going on as well, which is another sort of key issue, which is about overall quality versus kind of it being the band identity, if you see what I mean. I'll explain a little bit more what I mean. So there was this one moment in the recording process when Jam and Lewis put a female singer on, I think it was on the track Human, who wasn't actually in the band. And they put her on because they thought she sounded better on the record for that particular purpose. Now, Joanne Catherall, who was a female singer in the Human League, kind of wasn't particularly happy about that. And she went to Jam and Lewis and went, hang on, you've got this, you've got this other lady singing on the track, but I'm the singer in the Human League. And their attitude was kind of like, well, she sounds pretty good on the track, so let's just leave her on the track. But the Human League's attitude was more like, well, even if she does sound better, that's not the point, because she doesn't sound like the Human League. There's no one better at sounding like Joanne Catherall than Joanne Catherall herself. So, even though your vocalist may be technically better, let's just say, that's not the point. But so for Jam and Lewis, it was all like, let's get the best record made, and it doesn't particularly matter who does what. With the Human League, it was very much about, okay, this is a Human League record, and we want the Human League to be doing it. So there was a thing there as well. And also in terms of, who had the power and control. Now, I'm not saying Jam and Lewis were a big sort of insisted on loads and loads of control. They did like to collaborate. With Janet Jackson on Control, the Control album, ironically named, they did collaborate really well with Janet, according to the interviews. There were just the three of them, really. There was Jimmy Jam, there was Terry Lewis, there was Janet Jackson, all jamming away, all working together, three of them, in quite close working relationship. So they definitely allowed her creative control. But I think when the Human League came over, Jimmy Jam admits in interviews, that it was the first time that what they'd done and the way they were had really been questioned, so there was definitely a bit of a power struggle there. And also, there's only one Janet Jackson, but there were 6 people in the Human League at the time. So there may have been a bit of a kind of too many cooks thing going on. So what happened in the end? How did the album actually work out? Well, the Human League at some point went home and left Jam and Lewis to finish the album. Following that, the band split, effectively. There were 6 members, official members at the time. I'm struggling to get the sleeve out of here. So with those 3, but those 3, Ian Burden, Jim Russell and Adrian Wright, all left the Human League pretty quickly after the experience of making that album. Now, I know that Adrian Wright in particular did feel, a little bit sidelined, I suppose, but during that process. I don't want to speak too much out of turn, but I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about that. I would say there are arguments to suggest that the recording of that album did lead to the departure of those members, although it may be more complex than that. So, in a way, that was a big, big thing. Now, one other odd thing that happened, because nobody really expected the album to do particularly well, I don't think, but they did have a #1 single from that album in the USA. Very difficult to get USA #1s. So it kind of went completely the other way, really, from what might have been expected. There was a smash hit single, Human, which went straight to, not straight to #1, it did go to #1 in the USA, but actually it was a Jam and Lewis record, so I'm not surprised that it was popular, because it sounded like Jam and Lewis. It didn't actually sound very much like the Human League at all. So they were in this weird situation of, oh, hey, we've just had this, possibly quite negative experience. Band members are leaving or have left, and now we're #1 in the USA. But it was a bit of an outlier, that. The follow-up, I Need Your Loving, which is not well liked by Human League fans at all, didn't really have as much of the charm as Human, and it was a bit of it was a massive flop, actually. That's basically what happened. Now, the Human League did continue. Joe Callis, who was in the band prior to Crash, actually came back and worked with them again on hits in the future like Heart Like a Wheel and other tracks on albums, and Philip Oakey and the Giant Catherine and Suzanne Sully carried on with various other people and continued the Humour League for many years. In fact, it's still going now. But there's no doubt that was kind of like quite a big moment. So I suppose the point that I'm making is that producer and working relationships with artists can be hugely important, not just for the album and the single at the time, but for the records and the careers of both of them following that. And we've seen how it can make careers and it can break careers, just that working relationship. I should say, incidentally, that in interviews, Jam and Lewis and the Humour League have always said that their personal relationships were good, and they've actually spoken positively about the personal relationships between the production team and the band. So it's just the working relationships actually that were problematic. There was no actual problem with the personal relationships, which is quite interesting. But I just think it's a really good case study of how there are so many things that can be different in terms of the attitude and approaches of artists and producers. But I suppose my take-home message is, yes, we all probably thought that the relationship between producers and bands was important, but how important did we think it is? I'm going to suggest that maybe it's more important than some of you actually even would have thought it was. Right, so that's my talk done. I think I've done everything I want to say. If you're interested in music production at University of Chester, please email me at j.mason@chester.ac.uk, and you can ask me anything you want. Like I say, it's not all just about learning about producing production styles. There's only a small part of it. Quite a lot of it is about practical production and stuff as well, and all sorts of other interesting, exciting stuff. It's a really, really fun and exciting, enjoyable and robust course. So hopefully I'll now be available in the comment section, wherever that is, to do Q&A. So thank you very much, and I've enjoyed doing this. Bye.